Hello and welcome to the third in our mini-series on the pandemic interviews for leadership, complexity and inclusion. Today I'm interviewing Neil Carr. Neil Carr is the Chief Executive of the Mindlands Partnership Foundation Trust, which is a relatively new NHS trust. So Neil, could you tell us just a little bit about MPFT and also your role, please?
It's hard to believe, but Mindlands Partnership Foundation Trust has only just, on the 1st of June, celebrated its second birthday, and a tremendous amount has happened in that time. The mechanism, the legal process for bringing what was the former SSOTP, Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent Partnership Trust, which was a physical healthcare provider dominated by community services, and South Staffs and Shropshire Healthcare, which principally was a mental health learning disability service together, was to create an integrated service. Foundation trusts, as you know, are able to acquire non-foundation trusts, so that was the legal vehicle that was used. That said, we very much tried to handle it as a merger, because what we wanted to celebrate way before that point of merger acquisition was the best of both organisations and an integrated organisation coming together to provide a far more comprehensive offering than the two organisations had been able to do historically. So that happened on the 1st of June with Secretary of State approval. That brought about 8,500 staff together. We now serve a population of about 1.2 million across Staffordshire and the city of Stoke-on-Trent, as well as Shropshire. And that overall represents about 70% of our business, because about 26-30% of our business happens well outside of Shropshire and Staffordshire, and they are national, international services. So an example of a national service could be the contracts we enjoy with Her Majesty's Prison Service to provide physical mental health care inside a range of prisons. But equally, that could be the work we do with the Ministry of Defence in terms of serving personnel requiring inpatient mental health care. We are the host provider. We have 6 other providers across Scotland and the rest of England, and that just gives a flavour of the other types of services. So a very comprehensive provider of service. Our main activities are in the community, and we would pride ourselves on that. Services should be about avoiding admission to hospital, whether that be physical health care through the work we would do with primary care, with general practice, or whether that be the work we're doing with other agencies, social care, for example, in managing people with a learning disability or a mental health issue. But if someone needed to come into hospital because their condition couldn't be managed elsewhere, either from a mental health and LD perspective, or stepping up from community into hospital for physical healthcare reasons, we've got a bed estate of about 350, 400 beds. But the priority is to attempt to manage people in the community. I've been a chief executive for 15 years. The last 2, obviously, as chief exec of the newly merged organisation. But one of the exciting things for me was I had 12 months leading up to the acquisition to be the substantive chief exec of one of the organisations and the interim chief exec of the organisation that was to be acquired. So I was able to get in there to really look at what good looked like, to make sure we were capturing the best, so that when our application was submitted to the Department of Health to become a new organisation, we had a very robust business case. And of course, as chief exec, I'm the accountable officer, but I do have a complete team whether that be operational, strategic, finance, professional, a complete team that I work with. The one point I'd want to stress, that was going to be a big organisation, maybe just short of £500 million, and it couldn't be managed through a traditional route of a chief operating officer. So we took the decision to have 4 groups, each headed up by a managing director that also account to me, one for Staffordshire, one for Shropshire, one for children and families, and then another for specialist, which embraces all of those out-of-area services. So that's the makeup of the organisation, and I have the privilege of coordinating that, but through setting very clear objectives and within very clear boundaries, facilitating the managing directors to deliver our business.
Thanks, Neil. I have the pleasure and privilege of having one of your managing directors on the current MBA Senior Leader Programme that we run. But take me back a little bit to what you talked about in terms of the merger for the organisation. That sounds quite an interesting thing. What else can you tell me about that?
One of the fundamental reasons for bringing the organisation together was not just to create a health offering, no matter how integrated and comprehensive that might be, but equally we know on that continuum of care, that biological, psychological, social, spiritual contract that we have with our communities. One of the very exciting issues was bringing social care into the tent and ensuring that we could really enhance our social care offering, and that social care staff would become fully integrated members of the multidisciplinary team. That is something I think has gone from strength to strength within the organisation.
Thanks, Neil. So that we can get a feel for how the pandemic has changed things, what were the challenges and priorities prior to the pandemic?
Prior to the pandemic, what had we been concentrating on? Well, establishing this new organisation, recruitment to the new structures, really challenging the behaviour, the culture, the way we do things around here. It had been very different between the two organisations. One I felt was far more control and command, and the other was far more facilitative of staff to make decisions at the grassroots. We'd had many QI initiatives. Virginia Mason, in pursuit of the perfect patient experience, was the main vehicle we were going to use to move forward. But there had been very different approaches to organisational development within the two organisations, and I think that would have created confusion and is something we couldn't have continued with. So a lot of energy pre the pandemic had gone into creating the right structures which were liberating of individuals, facilitating the values of the Virginia Mason model, where staff were empowered to make decisions. And that was a significant journey we started, I guess, before and following the acquisition. I've said that this was about integration, but people were still working in their silos. They were still delivering their bit of the service. We didn't necessarily have pathways which facilitated the whole experience, the whole of the patient and service user, carer journey. And that was something we had to challenge significantly. What did evidence base look like? What was best practice, and how could we move towards it? How did we want to embrace general practice in a very different way so that we could work with them, particularly around long-term conditions, frailty, major issues really, that should have been about shifting left, taking people away from the acute hospital and wherever possible managing them in the community. Good examples of that might be it could be around rheumatology, it could be around diabetes, it could be around cardiac failure, it could be around coexisting dementia with various forms of physical health conditions. So that's where a lot of the energies were going prior to the pandemic. We also had to look long and hard at the IM&T, the health informatics systems. They didn't facilitate one output. They weren't harmonised with social care. So there were a lot of corporate issues that needed to be addressed as well. We had to completely engage. We engaged completely and in a very different way with our workforce in terms of what was our strategic direction, what would our 5-year plan look like. Certainly to live our values, we didn't want to impose it on the organisation, so we spent many months with different groups being clear, what are the issues, what is the evidence telling us, how do we need to move? And that's where a lot of our energies went, certainly for the first 12-18 months post acquisition. We then started to settle the organisation down, we started to get traction, and then the pandemic hit us.
So in some ways, it was very fortunate that the organisation had reached that settled stage. But of course, the pandemic has been quite far-reaching. It's impacted all of our lives. It's had effects on the work context, the home context, the family context. What effect has the pandemic had on your organisation, on your leadership? Given the fact that we're now coming into the easing of lockdown, what are your reflections on the impact of the pandemic?
As I've said, before we got into the management of COVID-19, we weren't only establishing very clear frameworks, empowering of staff, harmonising the issues I've talked around OD and quality improvement, for example, but we were also developing some really exciting out-of-the-box services. We wanted to demonstrate a real shift. A great example of that could be, I've already talked about social care and how it's part of the lifeblood of the organisation. But when one of the very senior social care staff came to talk to me and said, you know what, we could make a far better offering to service users if we provided them with real alternatives to the traditional care services we offer. What about people with anxiety? What about people with depression? What about people who are lonely to go on and develop all sorts of mental health issues? What about people who are isolated? How do we embrace those individuals? So one of the great opportunities was around libraries. Staffordshire County Council had made a conscious decision to disinvest in the management of libraries. We actually bid for services to take over the management of libraries, and since that time it's gone from strength to strength to strength, and that was a perfect example of how our agendas were growing. I think also we've done much work over a number of years, but we're able to fast track alternatives to empower people to be responsible for their own health and social care needs. So one of the things we were able to further enhance was a recovery college, whereby staff and service users would learn together. They would come together to share their experiences. They would act as champions by experience to help us as an organisation challenge the way we do things around here. So there was much traction, and then there was only one agenda. And that was how we were going to prepare to manage the pandemic. It's true to say much of that was focused on the acute sector. And I think everyone will be aware that was really going to manage people who were most seriously ill, who needed ventilation, who needed oxygen, those individuals that would need admission to hospital. And that's where a lot of our energies went. How could we support the acute hospitals to discharge as many patients as possible to create that capacity for ventilated beds, enhanced medical care. And over a matter of weeks, we were able to discharge back into the community hundreds and hundreds of individual patients from the beds. That meant we had to stand down a number of our routine services, and they happened in mid-March because a lot of people had to be redeployed. Hundreds of people had to be redeployed into these new services we'd had to establish at breakneck speed in the community to support people coming out of hospital. And again, that got traction very quickly and moved to a strong position where we were able to guarantee patient safety, staff satisfaction. Staff needed to be equipped with new skills, but that happened very quickly. It's interestingly, thinking back, the pandemic gave us permission. It enabled us to bring about rapid change that we would have struggled to do, I suspect, had we not have had such a major national emergency to confront. And I think that was the complexity of leadership. With hindsight, the easy thing to do was to stand down services. And we knew those non-essential services. We knew we could redeploy staff. We knew we would have to create a range of what-if scenarios. So what if the acute trust became swamped with patients, and there were some patients that no longer needed ventilation, flat ventilation, but would need oxygen therapy? Could we provide that in some of our community hospitals? So very quickly we reviewed our inpatient estate and developed an estate where we could have 120 odd patients who would require oxygen. Those facilities all had to be stood up urgently. That required us to redeploy staff, or that required us to tell staff we might redeploy them at very short notice. And we agreed as a system that notice would be within 48 hours. If those facilities were needed, could we bring them on stream? And could we staff them appropriately? Now, I'm delighted that it never ever got to that point, but it taught me a very powerful lesson. We'd raised staff's awareness and levels of what might happen, and it never happened. But we kept staff on standby for some 4 to 6 weeks, and I think that created some tension and frustration for staff. Some very powerful learning there for me and the organisation. One of the other things we did, we had to send the best part of 2,500 staff to work from home. 12 weeks on, a number of those staff are still working from home. One of the things we had to look at in terms of complexity, so what IM&T, what health informatics services did we need to facilitate that working from home? And our IM&T department, within the space of 2 weeks, I suspect, made things happen that we would not have been able to make happen in 2 years had we not have had this major pandemic to deal with. So the pace of change, but we were moving at a pace where we weren't always able to guarantee the outcomes. We were having to be fluid, we were morphing, we were having to take stock as we further developed and moved forward. But 12 weeks post the pandemic, we've now done something like 8,500 virtual consultations where service users have continued to be reviewed by consultant medical staff, senior practitioners, allied health professions, etc. And that has worked very, very effectively. As I look back over the last 12, 14 weeks, I suppose fundamentally what's been different is the speed of change. We haven't necessarily had time to think through the consequences. We've had to move very, very quickly. So I suppose it goes back to what I've said. It's how do you ensure that effective communication with the right people at the right time, 3 times a day, 5 times a day, 10 times a day. The fact that we were having to work in very different ways. Look, I don't underestimate what some staff have always done. They've always burned the midnight oil. But we've had to establish systems whereby we've got very responsive processes working 24 hours a day. We've had to have a catalyst of people who've become very intimate. All COVID-related information is coming into a central point. People who can help to analyse that for us, brief people like me, logists who can keep very contemporaneous records, actions that are no longer taking days and weeks to be monitored, but are being monitored within hours. These are the things where I think people have truly stepped up to the plate, the pace, the speed at which the organisation has had to respond.
Well, I think I speak for many people when I offer my thanks and gratitude for the way that you and your organisation, the NHS Trust in general, has responded to a really complex, ever-changing, rapidly evolving, fluid situation, as you quite rightly highlighted there, and has done so with the admiration and respect of the nation, really. And it's been good to see the nation respond positively and value our NHS again. So you have the situation with COVID and the pandemic, but then other things happen on the world stage, don't they? And I'm thinking of the killing of George Floyd and the impact that that's had and the reactions that that's created. What happened in terms of those sorts of issues in the context of the pandemic?
So we've got all of that happening, but then we have such powerful learning. So Black Lives Matter is a major issue now. And when we look at the nature of this pandemic and how it appears to be disproportionately affecting members of our BAME community, we needed to take stock both of what the mood was of society, but how did we protect, how did we keep safe, how did we respond to the needs of our BAME community. A good example could be 53% of our medical workforce come from a BAME background. That is their ethnic origin. And one of the things we've had to do is introduce robust risk assessments for that group of staff. We've had to challenge the working environment for members of the BAME community. Perhaps now it's no longer appropriate, even with PPE, for those individuals to work in COVID positive areas. So we've had to be very flexible on a whole host of issues, but that to me is one great example where the organisation has responded and continues to respond very quickly to meet the needs of its service users and staff.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Neil. The heart of the Leadership, Complexity and Inclusion series is around that question of inclusion and diversity, and critical incidents like this really do bring them sharply into focus, and it's fascinating and really important to understand how organisations and leaders respond to those. Thinking about your own leadership now, how has the pandemic affected you personally and your leadership?
At a personal level, how's this impacted on me? I think in many ways, I always knew as a senior leader, my job was about maintaining morale, about ensuring that staff felt safe, secure. There were very clear objectives. We were moving forward in a managed and measured way, that we would have ways of testing where we were at. We had regulators that would make demands of us. And then, of course, a lot of that got put on hold, but a lot of that also was accelerated. So for me, one of the fundamental issues was, how did I accept responsibility for communicating with the workforce? This was a question that I struggled with and I discussed with my senior team, but we had to respond very quickly. One of the things we've established since I think it was mid-March, maybe the 19th of March, was a daily briefing to the workforce to establish a webinar where staff with any concerns could come onto a webinar, discuss them. People like executives, me, managing directors would be there to answer questions. And I think one of the things I've challenged myself on a daily basis, am I doing enough? Are our leaders doing enough to sustain and to support the workforce? And that's been a real challenge. I think also one of the issues for me is I've found it necessary to work part of my time remotely, and MS Teams, Microsoft Teams has facilitated that very effectively. But I've also felt a need to be visible within the organisation to show solidarity. And that has had to be measured as to how do I achieve that without interfering, without going into areas where if I went to a ward department, I would be creating the wrong message. Unless you need to be there, stay away. So I've had to try and manage some of my personal anxieties and to navigate through those over the last 12 weeks. But I think fundamentally for me, it's been about ensuring that staff feel safe and secure. It's building morale. And I have been in awe, shots in the arm I've had most days of the week when staff have found creative ways within their local teams of supporting one another, of doing things, whether it be dancing, whether it be art. It goes by many, many different names. And I think one of the things we have had to find is ways for our staff at a distance who are working remotely at home, how do they keep contact with their teams? And again, this is something that I've been very interested in promoting the huddle boards, the virtual teams, the groups coming together, and that's had a very positive impact. But some staff have struggled. They've struggled with the isolation. They've struggled to work from home because their kids have been away from school. Again, it goes by lots of different reasons and names. And one of the things that I felt a personal sense of responsibility is to give individuals permission to do what is best, that they're not being judged. I've heard it said on several occasions, I feel I'm being judged by my colleagues because I'm remaining at home, or perhaps I'm not as productive as I might be. And I found that very sad, and on occasions it's potentially impacted on me and my mood. So I've been very clear, you're doing the right thing by staying away from work, and one size doesn't fit all. And I think that's had the biggest impact on me, just trying to engage with people on their terms.
I can certainly relate to the effect of the pandemic in terms of both the amount that's had to be done and the rapid timeframes that's had to happen in. And I'm sure many of the people watching today will also relate to that and resonate with that. To wrap things up, just as a final question then, how has the pandemic affected your view of leadership? How has it either changed, challenged, or refocused your understanding of leadership, Neil?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? How did the pandemic change my understanding or practice of leadership? You know, if I'm honest, my formal leadership training from Birmingham Uni is 35 years out of date, but I was always taught in that notion of the strategic, the tactical, the operational. There's the managing the steady state, there's the managing of the wicked issues, but this was unprecedented. And I think one of the things that this has challenged me on is in uncharted territory, in uncharted waters, You don't necessarily have a route map, a set of policies and procedures. You've got some guidance, of course you do, but you've got to be bringing your team together very regularly. You've got to be prepared to be flexible, to change very quickly. You've got to be able to read the mood. You've got to be able to respond to a government diktat within 24 hours. And you can only do that if you're working as an absolute unit, if you're working together. So for me, I'm delighted that it's re-established for me the importance of people, of doing it with and through individuals, and not just relying on systems and processes and standard operating procedures or whatever else it may be. Of course they've got a place, they're important, but I think it's bringing it back to me. It's that human touch, it's that interaction, it's us together being flexible, being fluid, that makes the real difference. And that really has recharged me, refreshed me in more ways than one.
What a great way to bring this particular interview to a close, thinking about our role as leaders in the context of working together with everyone who works with us. So thank you very much for that, Neil. Much appreciated. Join me next time when I'll be speaking to Trudy Beswick. Trudy is the Chief Executive of Caldwell Children. Until then, stay safe, and I look forward to you joining me next time.